Hi everybody, I'm Jim Setzer. This is Images by Design Studio, and this is another one of our photographers workshops. Tonight, our topic of conversation is macro photography, and I've got some things I want to share from my experience. I got a little bit of a demo going on. I hope everybody in the room has some experience they want to share, or they want to just get into macro, and we're just kind of getting in here to kind of get an idea of what it's all about and how to get started with it. The reason we picked macro is because this is the topic of this month's group's photo contest, so I'm hoping to see a lot more entries, and maybe if you come to this workshop and you try this a little bit, maybe you will join us in that as well. Sound good? Again, I'm Jim Setzer. This is my studio. Thank you all for coming. You know about me. I'd like to go around the room, starting with some fresh faces. Introduce yourself. What do you shoot? What's your experience with macro photography? What are you hoping to get out of tonight?
I'm brand new. My name is Suzanne.
Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you.
What do you shoot?
Canon
Okay.
and nature.
Okay, great. So your experience with doing macro photography?
Very little.
Very little. Okay, great.
I'm Billy. I shoot Nikon, and landscape photography is my favorite, but I also do portraits.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I shoot Canon. I normally shoot sports mainly, but right now I'm doing my senior pictures from the athletes at the high school.
Great.
I'm Tim. I've shot a little of this and a little of that, mostly landscapes, but more recently I've been trying to get portraits, and I've done a little bit of macro photography, but not very much.
All right, great. Mike?
I'm Michael. I shoot Nikon, and I'm mostly into landscapes, wildlife. I do play a little bit around with portraits and macro. I tried the tubes. Now I got a macro lens, and to me it's much easier.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting.
Yeah, great.
My name is Leonard, Leo for short. Shoot portrait, a little bit of nature, landscape. I guess I just kind of whatever catches me that day. Shoot Sony. That's it.
Great. Pete?
I'm Pete. If you don't know me by now, you haven't watched enough of Jim's videos. I shoot Canon. I shoot anything that stops in front of my lens,
Some things that don't.
and some things that don't. But not really. I don't chase birds.
What's your macro experience?
I've played around with extension tubes, macro lenses. One thing I do want to get is a nice rail system so I can get it to stacking.
Yeah. Okay.
Not that it's a more of a fun thing for me than anything else. You're not gonna go out and be the world's best macro photographer, but it's fun to do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of the way I look at it. It's something to do in the downtime, right? I've had a couple of commissions to do some product photography that required a little bit of macro work, but for the most part, it's just fun stuff. Right? Great. All right, so I always put together a short little, I usually put together a short little presentation, and what just happened to that? Hey, look at that. It's not an agenda, I just call it topics. These are just my thoughts. I threw these down on this slide stack about an hour ago to kind of make sure I put all my thoughts on paper, and like I said before, if I'm missing something, please speak up and add. If you catch me in a lie, please speak up and say, no, that's not right, or my experience is different, because everybody here has a different experience, and that's kind of what we're here for, just to share experiences. So we did our introductions. I figured I'd start by throwing down a couple of different macro photography definitions, talk about some options on the kinds of equipment you might or might not have or want to look into for doing macro photography. Different techniques for doing macro on location versus in the studio, because for me at least they seem very, very different. I like to put it all together. Pete mentioned focus stacking. I got a short little demo here, and we'll do a little bit of that. And then maybe a mention or two about special considerations for lighting when you're working with macro, and any other topics you guys come up with along the way. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
All right, great. So I went out and I looked, and there were a couple different definitions of macro photography, and I don't know, my definition is just anytime you're creating an image that is larger than its typical, life size, whether that be flowers or bugs, or fine detail of a larger object, or something where you're typically viewing it or printing it larger than its size in real life. You can see a couple of others that I found online that make kind of basically say the same thing. Are you seeing that?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. Any other definitions you guys think of? Anything you want to add to the definition?
Did you get that last one?
Is there a typo?
Microphotography?
Yeah, sometimes it's called microphotography, but and sometimes like in the Nikon world, you see the lenses are called micro lenses, not macro lenses. But for the most part, those are interchangeable terms.
But it's not using a microscope.
Yeah, typically you're not looking at microscopic things. You're just looking at things that are typically small and making them appear larger in your images.
Nope. There you go.
Okay, so why is macro different than other forms of photography? And for me, I kind of look at it this way. The two discriminators that set macro or micro photography apart is distance to the subject is very, very short, right? You're making things much larger than they are, which usually means you're going to be putting objects in front of your camera much closer than you typically do. And most lenses have a minimum focusing distance, right? You can only get so close to the camera before you can no longer get focus, right? Because there's mechanically, optically, there's just no way to do it. Part of what you're doing with macro photography is you're shortening that distance. You're allowing those objects to get closer to your camera so you can see them larger. And second point is kind of a really important side effect of that, and you probably already know this from your portraiture and even landscapes. The closer your subject is to your camera, the more shallow the depth of field, regardless, without changing the aperture, right? So, you take f2.8, but your subject's a mile away, you still have a really nice, big, deep perceived depth of field where you put somebody right in front of the camera and, you maybe catch the focus on their eye, but the tip of their nose is out of focus, right? Same aperture, but they're much, much closer. And so as we move things closer and closer to the camera, we're going to get tiny little depths of field that we're going to have to work with, either creatively or technically to solve some of those depth of field problems. Yes, I saw a hand start to go up. No? Comment? No? No? Any other discerning things about macro photography that you think of should be added?
That whatever your subject is, has to be perfectly still.
What do you think so? I've seen some bumblebees in flight macro photography that look pretty stellar.
Okay, and that goes back, I guess, to these definitions, because mine is that very close, where not just a close-up, but right, that grain of salt, that looks like it's this. But again, that's tomato.
Yeah.
Is that because when you're doing macro photography, you're either using a longer shutter speed than you might otherwise, or possibly because, kind of like when you use a long lens, a little bit of motion gets exaggerated.
I think it's more because you have such a shallow depth of field. If you're chasing that bumblebee, you might get his back end and not the head that you wanted, because you got to be right there.
So he's moved out of your focus point.
That focus point is so small.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that depth of field, I remember looking at doing some flowers and it was like,
A little bit of breeze is enough to,
Yeah. Right.
so that's why I say it's got to be still.
tripod.
I rest my case.
Makes it easier, that's for sure. The things we're going to demonstrate today, the one I have here in this example, it's not moving, so it makes it a lot easier. Okay, options for shooting macro. One thing you could do is find the little tulip mode in your camera. All that really is doing in your camera, whether that's a point and shoot that's got the little tulip thing, or it's on your mode dial, or it's down in some menu somewhere. All that's doing is it's telling your camera your focal range is here to here. It's not going to reach out at infinity to try to catch focus, so it really is helping your autofocus system out by letting it know, hey, we're gonna be trying to get some autofocus, but it's gonna be up close to camera. Don't bother reaching for infinity and all the way back and improve that. What do you think, Pete? Do you see any other differences in Canon cameras when people flip that into macro
So
mode?
it does,
Yeah.
ignore anything back there and only look up here.
Yeah, it cannot change the optics of what's in front of it. It's, the camera body is the camera body. Magnifying filters is another thing you could do. These are basically just screw on your filter thread. They're garbage. They truly are. I've tried a couple, I even spent some good money on a couple that were supposed to be better optical quality, but I found that your results were horribly milky and they just were not sharp, they weren't clear, they distort terribly. I personally wouldn't recommend trying them unless you're going for some kind of a weird ethereal look, and you're going for that because they're not going to give you what most of us are looking for, that sharp, clear, close-up shot. So that's why I put the Mr. Young face there. Another option is to go out and buy a dedicated macro lens. Notice the S's are dollars because they're not cheap lenses. They're expensive and sometimes more expensive than a good portrait lens. The only difference between them and their regular portrait equivalent is they've simply moved all the lens forward a little bit to bring that close in focal distance or distance to subject closer in, so you can view them a little bit closer. You can use a macro lens to do a little bit of portraiture, especially headshots and things like that. So they do have uses beyond macro, but go ahead.
The 100 that we have, it's a phenomenal portrait lens. So I tell people, don't be afraid to use it other than on a macro. Pull it out of your bag and take other pictures and see what you get. You don't like it.
Yeah, so let me pick your brain on it. So where are the downsides? I mean, you certainly, you're not going to get the reach that you would get with a typical 100 prime, right?
It's 100, it's 100, right, isn't it? I'm throwing it back at you. I mean, it's 100 millimeter lens.
Right.
So 100's 100, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
Okay, so it's allowing you to do the macro, like you said
Well,
before.
but everything's a trade-off. So what I'm trying to find, honestly, I'm trying to find the trade-off.
I don't know the downside.
Yeah.
I don't.
Maybe the
It doesn't have
price.
an image stabilizer.
Well, but most primes don't, right?
Some do, some don't, but
What was that, Tim?
Probably the price.
Is it more expensive than your like 85 prime? Similar equivalent?
no.
About the same.
The 100 millimeter, the non-L lens was $600, and the L series lens was regular 900 on sale for $750.
And the 85 is $2 grand. Well, my point was, don't, like you said, don't be afraid to try it on other things other than just that macro shot.
If you don't have the money to spend on a macro lens, a dedicated macro lens, or it's not something you think you're going to be doing a lot of, there's a couple of other options. One of them is a bellows, which you see in that picture there, and that literally just sits between the camera and the lens and lets you move the lens away from the camera, therefore magnifying the image, doing that. And what most people use are these things called extension tubes, and Pete mentioned extension tubes. They're literally this. They're just a little pancake thing here. There's no optics in it. And it just simply spaces the lens out away from your camera a little bit. Now, the really basic ones don't even have electronic lugs, meaning all the electronic communications between your camera body and your lens are disrupted because there is no electronics here. Those are $10. You can get those all day long from China on Amazon or whatever. These are a little more expensive in that they do have the lugs, so things like autofocus, or in the case of this lens, it does not have an aperture ring, so you have to change your aperture electronically. So you need the lugs in here. For me, I found that I use the autofocus quite a lot, and I do use lenses that don't have aperture rings, so it was worthwhile to spend I think these were like 40 or 80 or something like that. And you'll get a set of them. This one's 15 millimeters, that one's what, 20 millimeters, and that one's like 32 millimeters. And you can use one of them, or you can stack them together. So I've never had a reason to put them all together, but you could stack them all out and really get a heavy magnification out of that.
And really, it's a really inexpensive way, I mean, instead of going out and spending the money for a lens. I mean, I've got it set for my Nikon for under $100.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I think it was $79 or something.
Yeah.
And I still have one out about the lens.
Right, and we'll talk about that next, why you might want to do that. One of the other things, and this is not as common, but I have one of these here, is a reversing ring. So, and normally you wouldn't do this with a 50mm lens, you'd pick a telephoto or something, but basically this just either, like in this case, it just matches your camera mount and allows you to literally put a lens on your camera backwards. It just has a filter thread on it. And now you can just take any old lens. It doesn't have to be the same manufacturer or anything. You're just working with the optics, because as you can see, there's no coupling here. And you just put that on there, you screw it in, and now my lens is literally mounted on the camera backwards. So if this were a 200mm lens, you'd have basically a 200mm macro. Kind of makes sense? They also make them that are just threads on both sides. So you could take and front mount a lens, you have an aperture and all the other things that you could talk to it with. Then on your filter ring, there's the thread that matches this lens, and there's another set of threads that match the other lens that you put backwards in front of that one. And I don't know, I've had mixed results with those. I played around, obviously I bought this one because it was like $9 or something, just to play around with it to see what I got. And although the results were kind of interesting, they weren't really all that fantastic, so I did.
What's the toy?
Yeah, I didn't really use it. I've seen some images that come from them that look fantastic, but I think, like anything, you really have to spend an awful lot of time and energy with that particular setup that you've cobbled together to really get the results you're looking for. Any other options you guys can think of? You said Pringles can.
I've seen it.
Yeah, I mean, really, because extension tubes, literally all they are is they're moving that lens out. So you could use anything that could block the light from getting in from the side.
And you do have bellows up there, but you really have a hard time, I mean, I don't know, you have a hard time finding them these days?
Yeah, they're not all that common because extension tubes are around and they're pretty cheap, and they have the electronic transmissions. I don't think I'd ever seen a set of bellows that actually had lugs in it. Did you? Yeah, I don't think so. But the nice thing about them is that they are adjustable. So here, if I decided this was too much, I wanted to back it off, or I want to add another extension tube, I have to take it apart, snap it in, where that actually just has a dial. I can sit there and dial and adjust it. So that's the only real advantage that bellows might have over this.
Would the rail fall into this, or is that another topic?
What's that?
The rail, will that fall into this or another topic?
The rail?
Having a rail system.
For well, yeah, we'll talk about that when we do like some focus stacking. Mm-hmm. All right. All right. I don't do a lot of macro out in the wild. I tried it a couple of times, getting like live flowers and bugs and stuff, and it just really wasn't me. I'm more of a technical shooter. I want to be able to sit down and think about my subject and work through it and kind of, mechanize the whole thing, and that kind of shooting really isn't for me. Now, if you're a wedding photographer, so you got to get that ring shot, and time is of the essence. You really want to get the perfect shot. You want to get it right. There's probably the perfect opportunity to justify going out and buying that macro lens, because for all those reasons, right? It's part of your business. Everybody wants the ring shot. They're not going to let you have those rings for more than a couple of minutes, and you've got 1,000 other things you got to do too. So you got to get it right, and you got to move on. And so for wedding photographers, I can see that a dedicated macro lens all day long. Other things, when you're out in the wild, you're mostly going to be handheld. So you need to learn really good stability technique on top of having stabilized lenses or stabilized sensors, or both. Some of the newer cameras actually have coupled sensors, stability in both the lens and the sensor, and they give you like 5.5, 6 stops of stability, crazy. But you're talking very, very close up, which means you're going to be, the tiniest bit of motion is going to completely wipe out your shot. So stability is really important, and a lot of that's going to come down to technique. You can use tripods for some things, but a lot of times you're getting down really close to the ground. So unless you like bolt your camera to a frying pan and that's your tripod, you're really not going to be able to get low enough with a traditional tripod to be able to use it. What's that?
Beanbag.
Yeah, bean bags, yeah, or those platypods or some other of those specialty kind of things that, you know, that's what I'm putting in maybe there. I've seen people that'll flip their center post in their tripod upside down and hang their camera upside down from the bottom side of the tripod to get the shot. You know, obviously it's all upside down, but that's a good way to get your camera down low. If your camera's got a tilty screen, that's really good. You can put your camera down and tilt the screen up and use that. But then again, now you've got that stability thing. It's hard to hold the camera down like this and hold it as stable as you can upright like this with
I've used the
holding
monopod also, and just because and you're gonna get to it, the focus of the body, any little movement, and it's like,
Yeah,
man, it's not there.
right.
So, I mean, it just gives you that other little bit of stability to help with it.
Yeah, anything you can prop the camera up against, on, between, under, whatever is going to be helpful. But there may not be something around if you're in a garden or something and you're looking at flowers. It could just be you, and you never know. Depending on the garden, they may not allow tripods and stuff. I don't know. What's botanical garden? Do they allow tripods?
I've never had an issue.
Okay. What other shooting macro in the wild things, but as far as stability, do people use? Monopods, tripods, handheld,
Children.
leave it on the ground.
Stable platform.
Yeah.
Children,
Like you said, I've seen the frying pan trick.
Yeah.
Just
Right.
bolt a quarter 20 on there.
Yeah, you take an old frying pan, just put a quarter 20 bolt through the middle of it, and
Screw the camera.
it's great for sitting out on the beach or some other thing, place like that where you wouldn't. And those platypod things are kind of neat too, because they got little spikes you can screw it down and dig it into the ground and whatever. Then focusing, of course, focusing becomes a real problem. Like we talked about before, the depth of field is very, very shallow. So if you're shooting that bug or that flower or whatever it is you're up close with, the slightest movement back and forth is going to really shift that depth of field, probably completely off your subject if it's a small enough bug or whatever. And so you really start learning to focus with your head, right? You focus with your body and move back and forth. I'm exaggerating here, but just tiny amounts to move that focal point in and out. And shoot in burst mode, and just as it's clicking away, slowly pull your body back or forward. Just take a ton of pictures. One of those is going to be where you want it to be in focus. No, you hope, right? If you do it enough, and you take a lot of pictures. Unfortunately, that's kind of a spray and pray attitude. But a lot of times, it is what it is. All right, so in studio, which is most of the macro photography I do, I thought I'd throw together this quick and dirty little demo on how that works. And I think I had brought I'm going to tether this. Now, this is not a workshop on tethering, but, and maybe that's another topic for another day, but
Yes.
here's an example of a good time to tether. This program called Digicam, and it is, there's all different kinds of programs for tethering your camera to your phone, your tablet, your computer. They change all the time. I've used this one a long time, so it does everything I need it to do. It's a little buggy sometimes, but I've kind of gotten used to it, so I'm not changing. But, I'm sure if you just go out and Google, top 10 tethering tools or whatever for this day and age, you'll probably find a bunch of opinions about what kind of tools work best. But
Your Canon comes with EOS utility.
yeah, how good is that?
I had to throw a commercial in there.
All right.
And actually, I don't know about, I guess the Nikon can do it too, where you can access them through Lightroom.
Yeah.
Tether tools.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So, but I don't recommend it for this because the Lightroom tethering does not give you this preview, which is really
Okay.
important. Or some of the other things that are all part of this demonstration that
Okay.
I've got set up here. So, it should recognize when I connect a camera. And it does. And if I click on the camera in this guy, I can open up a window and I can see the live view right in the camera. So here we go. And you can see as I move that around. Look, it's a commercial for Nikon because it didn't have anything more interesting or sexy to.
Over there.
It's blurry.
I don't hear Winston. It's not Canon.
I can't read it, it's blurry.
Too far away.
There
I'm melting.
you go. Sorry, Pete.
Now, all right, so what you might be able to see here is if I focus on this little corner of that cap and get that into focus, even just the opposite corner over there is out of focus, right? My depth of field in this particular configuration is less than 3 millimeters.
And what aperture are you at?
Maybe 7.1, oh, f8. So at f8, I only have 3 millimeters of depth of field at this distance, so that's pretty tight, right? So if I wanted to get this whole little emblem here in focus, I can't do it at f8. So what are some of my options, Pete?
Stacking.
Well, before we get there,
Well,
let's,
yes, there's some options.
well, we could
Close down on your aperture.
close down your aperture. So I could do that. Let me just come in here and of course, let's see, let's go to f16. That's a pretty good aperture. But of course now I'm going to have to slow that shutter speed way down. Now I'm all hooked up here, so it doesn't really matter to me that I've got to slow this thing down. Maybe I'll make it, let's see what 8 seconds gives me. Now normally when I would do this, I would do it remotely and I wouldn't be in the room, right? I would literally be somewhere else.
Because you don't want even the slightest movement, or?
Right. Even on this concrete floor, just me walking around in the room is enough to, that's all zoomed in. Just me walking around in the room is enough to add vibration. So I would do all the things to reduce vibration. I would have, obviously I'm in mirror up because I'm doing live view, but I'd also put a timer on there. I'd be outside the room. I'd do all the things I could possibly do to reduce that vibration as much as I possibly could, and there'd still even be a little bit of it left. And as you can see, F16 did a better job of getting more in focus closer there, but it's still not there. You might be tempted to shut your shutter down even more, but the problem with going with most lenses beyond f16 is what's going to happen when you start getting much smaller apertures.
You lose resolution.
Diffraction.
Okay.
Yeah, so you start getting what's called diffraction in very, very small apertures. What happens with diffraction is that your ratio of the area of your aperture hole is to the actual circumference of your aperture blades is lower. What does that mean? A greater percentage of the photons that are passing through the aperture are getting close to the edges of those aperture blades. And photons sometimes act like energy, but sometimes they work like matter, and they're susceptible to gravity. So believe it or not, the little tiny amount of material that's in your aperture blades can bend photons if the photons are passing by them closely enough. And what happens, they diverge a little bit, and the thing gets a little bit soft. So I want to show that, because so what happens is you shut it all the way down to like f32 or some crazy small aperture, and the whole image just gets softer. It's like the whole thing's out of focus. You're like, what in the world happened? Well, you didn't do anything. It's just that's the way the optics of the thing works. And so I personally don't recommend going any lower than f16, even if you've got all the time in the world to shoot a long shutter speed. Of course, you could throw more light at it and speed that up as well. That's useful.
What's your ISO at?
100. Yep. So we noticed even with F16, we really weren't getting enough depth of field for what we were trying to do. What we could do is we could take a picture and adjust the focus point back a little bit, take another picture, focus it, change the focus a little bit more until we had enough pictures that we had sections of our picture in focus. Then we could take all those pictures together, we could stitch them together in what's called a focus stack, what Pete alluded to before. And that would take an awful lot of slow, meticulous sliding of this rail back and forth. And I've had to do it by hand before, and it's not real pretty and not real fun. And a lot of times, if you miss just one little section, you're going to get in focus, then out of focus, and in focus sections of the picture. It's going to look awful. This tethering software, like a lot of others, actually can automate a little bit of that. So I'm going to come in and we're going to automate a series, tell it to take a series of pictures and adjust the focus point along the way. All right, so I told it to lock focus on that green box right there, and I see that it's going to take a good 4 or 5 images adjusting along the way, a small amount along the way to make that happen. So I'm going to go into this simple focus stacking app, and I'm going to say go ahead and take 5 pictures, near to far, and a medium step. And normally I would say wait 10 seconds between pictures because I want all the vibration of just the shutter release to die down before I take another shot. I'm not going to bore you with that amount of time here, but...
So what is the step, the medium step?
Medium step.
How far?
Yeah, how many servo steps forward, and you can go in this tool and you can say how many micro steps you mean by small, medium, and large.
Mm-hmm.
So as you start to work your particular camera setup, you can start tweaking that and make it work for you. Near to far, medium steps.
Now, is it Nikon software or this is something different?
No, this is just some open source stuff I grabbed, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago and started playing around with it.
Still available?
Oh yeah, I think so. It's got some nice features to it.
It does. Shady evil ways. What's it called?
Digicam.
Digicam, yeah.
I'll forget that in 3 minutes.
That's what I put
Yeah,
it
Digicam control.
The answer was it wasn't dead when I found it.
Yeah,
But the freezer does wonders.
yeah, that's true.
So he caught the bug and he froze it,
Mhm.
and then he took it out and took his pictures of the dead bug that looked like, was it like a wasp or a bee?
I've been told that if you put them in for a short amount of time, basically it kind of immobilizes them.
Yeah.
But then you better take your pictures while you
Yeah,
can,
sure, yeah.
because
You wanna
once
be
it
there when
warms
that
up.
You wanna be there when that
Right.
wasp wakes up.
Right.
But I have noticed, and I've shot dragonflies out in the back when it gets hot and everything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can get pretty close and all they'll fly off.
Yeah.
Stay there.
Right.
Come
Because
right
they're
back.
coming right back.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. They always come back. But one of the reasons they want them to stay alive is because they lose the shine in their eyes and all this stuff that all just goes within minutes after they die. So if you want to get all the specular highlights in those multi-piece eyes, you have to be fresh, so to speak.
And they're kind of hard to focus on if you stepped on them.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
They don't move.
Well, you can focus, you just won't be able to identify them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then it becomes abstract art.
Yes. I bet you could do a whole gallery of smush bugs. People will buy it.
There was a
You
there
get
was a
started.
MoCA exhibit a couple years ago, and the guy had actually embedded live insects into the art. It was like this weird, crude photo emulsion art, and they actually had bits of bugs were part of it. All right, so whether you're out in the wild and you rock back and forth, and you got a stack of pictures of your bug or your flower, or you're in the studio, whether this is your kitchen table or something else, and you've got your stack of images, how in the world do you combine all these things together into a single image that has a much broader depth of field? And I just use Photoshop. There's a bunch of other programs that you can use that does the same thing, but I'll just go through the steps you would use in Photoshop to do it, and you can apply this to whatever program you decide you want to use. So in Photoshop, you'd start it up and you'd come in here to scripts, and one of the scripts here is load files into stack. And you go to your program, you go to find your pictures wherever you stored those pictures. All right, so there's the stack of pictures that the focus point is shifted along the way.
Forgive me, because I don't recall. Did you say the focus was going in and out, or was it going side to side?
Front to back,
Front to back.
or back to front, whichever setting you did. So focus typically doesn't go side to side.
Well,
If it's a
No,
dragonfly,
yes.
it might have.
Yeah, so it depends on how the focal plane is, right? The focal plane is never going to be perfectly perpendicular to the axis of your lens, so you just couldn't get it there. But if your image is skewed this way, right, you're still moving the focus of the lens in and out, but the effect will go side to side. If you're tilted on this axis, then the effect you'll see is focus moving up or down. All right, so you've selected that whole stack of images using that. I always say, please attempt to automatically align the source images. That way any changes or movement in your hand, and you might have noticed as you change focus, most lenses have a focus breathing problem, right? As you change focus, the image grows or shrinks. And so, unless you have one of those nice expensive Canon lenses, yes, this is a place where Canon excels, because they do two things. When they focus a zoom lens, they also shift the depth of field to compensate for the focus. So you don't have a focus breathing problem with Canons like you have with most Nikons and other third parties. All right. So this will take a second as Photoshop loads in that series of images we just took.
so we're waiting on this. What my point was, if you use a very shallow depth of field, okay, and you can then more or less do a panorama in a macro shot, focusing your points throughout the image. Your depth of field isn't changing, but the image is going to be sharper across the board. No?
I've never tried to manually do it that way. You're talking about literally manually cutting out the areas that you found in focus and then building a panorama from that.
Well, just running it through Photoshop, and it will locate your different focal points and then build that around there, I thought.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. That's exactly what I'm going
But
to do.
across this way, not this way.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where the shift in focus happens. What we're going to be doing is we're going to take each of these images and we're going to tell Photoshop, find the highest contrast, the sharpest parts of each one of these images, and only use that piece of the image.
Right.
So left to right, up or down, doesn't really matter.
But it's okay.
Okay, so we've loaded all those files in. They're raw files. I should have made them JPEG to make this go a little faster. And now it's aligning all those images. So a little focus breathing thing happened in there. So some of the images in the end will be a little smaller, some will be bigger, but in the end they will have all aligned so they're perfectly stacked on top of each other.
And while we wait, Jim is going to do a little song and dance.
No. You can sit there and just watch the little green bar. Yeah, so this is quite algorithm intensive, as you might imagine. I mean, it's looking at various regions of each of these images, and it's trying to find areas and regions that match. This one's actually pretty easy to work on for the computer because you've got very discrete lines, and they don't repeat all that much, right? There's only one lowercase n there, and so it's easy for the program to find that same image in the whole stack and start from there, and then shrink and scale and skew and all that kind of thing. If you've got a landscape or you've got a really complex flower that has a lot of repeating pieces, it may take a lot longer for it to figure out where everything goes in relation to the images around it, but it'll eventually usually get there. Every once in a while I've come across a stack where it just simply got lost trying to align things, and it was only because there was way too much similar pattern going on.
We like the panoramas where the people got 3 legs and.
Yeah, right, yeah, or they show up in 3 different places because they were walking along.
There's a program that will, you take a series of shots where you got people moving around, and it'll stack them together and remove the
Oh,
people.
that's Photoshop.
Yeah, can do that.
I've done it.
Okay, Photoshop's got that built in now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did it at the, Williamsburg, the big one. What's that, the governor's mansion?
Yep.
Governor's Palace.
And that's never ended. I took 20 shots, ran it through the same Photoshop, there's nobody there.
Wow.
We need to have a class on that.
Yeah, or just take a long enough exposure that all the people turn to ghosts.
You know, that would have been about 20 minutes.
Yeah. Like a big old piece of a welder's glass in front of your lens.
In some cases, they do look like ghosts too.
The only problem with that is if there's anything else like a flag, you only have the pole.
Oh, yeah,
But the flag's moving.
yeah, right. But a lot of times
Photoshop
you,
another flag in.
well, but a lot of times you can take that still image that contained the flag and you can brush that back in. So,
I've done it on the beach too. Flattens out the water and nobody's there. It's like, nah, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
I'm gone.
You're gone.
all right. Okay, so now we have loaded our big old stack of pictures into Photoshop and they've just been aligned. If you look closely on the edges here, you can sort of see some of those smaller, some of the images are smaller than others.
Could you zoom it in? Or
Um,
no?
yeah. If I had my regular mouse, it would be easier. Okay, can you sort of see where the stacked images are there? But they've been aligned, but then it's like, this one up top is, obviously the focus is not in this part of the picture, where the one that's larger down there, it's closer in focus, right? Okay, next step.
Too bad though.
Yeah, you zoom that back in again. All right, so the next step is to find all the focus points in each one of those, and luckily Photoshop can do that for you in one fell swoop as well. You have to select all the layers. Look, I've got all my layers selected. Good. Go under Edit. Auto align layers. Nope, sorry. Edit. Auto align layers.
Come on, script.
What's that? Auto blend layers.
Uh-huh.
There we go. And there you go. It says you have a stack of images. It even shows this little pair of mountains, but the sun is kind of out of focus in one of them. So, and then this goes and chugs away a little bit more. But what it's going to be doing is, again, it's going to look for the highest contrast areas in every one of those layers, those frames, and it's going to mask out everything that's not high contrast. In other words, all the things that are considered not in focus. And so as this churns through this, you'll notice the layer stack over there. You'll see a whole bunch of layer mask boxes appear, and then eventually all those layer masks will get populated by masking off the not in focus pieces, and then it'll build a top layer which is a composite of all of those. So basically all you need at the very end of this is this top layer that Photoshop's going to build for you. So it's a whole lot better than the old days when you used to have to do this by hand and find those high contrast areas and brush in those things or cut it and done. All right, so pay close attention. Notice how the upper corner there, it's very out of focus. The top stack right there, only the bottom portion is in focus. And there it's, you can see the layer masks have come in. Now it's populating all the layer masks. And now I've built this one layer at the very top of my stack where that whole field is focused in. Yeah.
Bravo.
Now, that whole stacked focus area is about 3.5 millimeters. So if you had a big, say, flower and you wanted petal to petal and you were shooting at an angle, you may have to do this technique and then pull your camera back, take another 20 shots, pull the camera back, take another 20 shots, pull the camera, and then stitch all those together. So you may have to do this several times if you're looking for extreme depth of field in a macro shot. So that's why Pete was saying you could have 300 pictures if you want to get the entire grasshopper in focus.
Now, again though, you can only do this here, connected to that. If you're in the field, you need the rail, and you gotta click, crank, click, crank, click, crank. How many shots was that one, 20?
Yes.
That looks like 20.
Yeah.
So that was 20 shots. And like you were
Yeah.
saying, if you just gotta do that flower, that's gonna be 100 shots.
Might be.
A very manual process unless you buy a rail that's powered. And then they click, click, so that's why this can get expensive.
It can. Some newer cameras actually do the focus, build the focus stack for you in camera. The D850 does it. And that actually works not only well for macro shots, but it also even works well for landscapes. How many times have you got a landscape, you'd like to get a foreground element in focus as well as the background? What do? You end up taking a whole bunch of shots and then brushing in the foreground or whatever to bring those elements together. If you got a camera, it's the same as an exposure bracket, but it's a focus bracket. Kind of neat. Still probably doesn't have enough range to do that whole big flower. You still may have to come in here and augment it with either a rocking technique or something like this, but you can get it done. So yeah, a lot of technical stuff to go into it to make it all happen, and a lot of it is practice. So you just got to sit down and this is like a rainy day project to sit down and play with what you've got, and just experiment with it and see how it works and do it. But in the end, you can get some really pretty amazing output to it. I mean, our example here was pretty boring, but like Pete was saying, when you see those really world award-winning macro shots, those are people that are stacking hundreds of images together using techniques like this.
Get a toy car and do it with that.
Yeah,
It doesn't have to be a flower or a bug.
right. And you could do flower macro photography in the dead of winter. Just go to Farm Fresh not Farm Fresh. Go to your local grocery store and just get a bundle of flowers and just put them on your kitchen table and start shooting them. I mean, and you're right. It could be anything around the house. It's to do it.
I've done it with actually a grain of salt, a single, not a stack.
Yeah.
A grain of salt and a high macro. You look at it and go, what is that? It's this square kind of crystal looking thing, but it looks like it's this big. It's awesome.
Yeah. And wintertime, people do those frozen soap bubble pictures. They're absolutely gorgeous with the kind of crystalline structures growing around the soap bubble. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things you can do with macro. Like I said, unless you're a wedding photographer or you're a specialty product photographer that get paid for that sort of thing, it's something we do as for fun on rainy days. But I think it's good. So that's kind of why I picked it as the contest for this month as well. I figured spring is coming. Finally, we're starting to see some buds in the trees. Bugs are starting to come out, so now's a good time of year to kind of get out there and play with this and try it. Last thing I wanted to mention, we talked about lighting considerations. So you might imagine when your subject is this far from the camera. Let me go back to my PowerPoint so I don't miss one of them. What's that?
Should have brought my ring light for show and tell.
Yeah, I don't have a ring light. Let me do that. Very first thing, your pop-up flash is not going to work. You're so close to here that your pop-up flash is just going to get blocked by your lens, even without a lens hood. So half your picture is going to be in shadow. So pop-up, you don't go out thinking you're going to shoot some macro photography and it's a cloudy day, I'll just use my pop-up. It's just not going to work. Forget that. Pop-up doesn't work. Hot lights, I use hot lights when I do this kind of work because I like to see exactly what I'm going to get out of the camera, where flashes, even with, you've got a modeling light or approximation of what the light's going to look like. So I do like hot lights. I use these panels and some smaller ones some small little camera mounted ones as well, so I can light the subject. He mentioned ring lights, a little light that actually fits around the actual lens itself. That gives if you're looking for a good flat light, that gives a nice good flat light. And if it's things like bugs, you can get the nice little ring catch light in the eyes, or all 300 eyes or whatever.
We got a macro lens with the ring light built into the lens, draws the power out of the
Yeah,
lens.
yep, seen that. So some of those ring lights are constant lights, they're hot lights. Others are flashes, so they literally have a little cable in a little box that plugs into your hot shoe and it fires. I don't really like those for macro photography because, like I said before, you're not seeing the light before you shoot it. You're having to take shots, dial it in, it takes a lot longer. Especially with macro stuff, for some odd reason I can never get strobed lights to light the way I want them to. I want to be able to see it in the viewfinder, in the tethered tool, whatever it is I want to use. Off-camera flash is helpful if you're going to go out, because say you got that flower, even if you've got a light out here, it really looks nice if you illuminate the back sides of the petals and make them luminescent. So having an off-camera flash, you can set back behind the flower or have somebody stand back there and backlight the subject, really helps out a lot. And these small objects, bugs and things, they have lots of little cracks and crevices where all kinds of harsh shadows can live. So having off-camera flash or a flashlight, you can get in there and kind of, soften up those shadows and flatten it out a little bit, kind of bring those highlights out is really important. Just having reflectors is helpful too, whether it's something big like that or just a little handheld reflector, so you can just bounce some light back into your subject, because there's lots of shadows growing, living in these small objects.
Small enough, use some tinfoil.
Yeah.
Aluminum foil.
Yeah, and I've just used, happened to have a light color baseball cap on one day, and that was just enough light. I could hold it next to the thing and get enough reflection off of that just to backfill a little bit and soften the shadows up. So, use what you got, use what's available. But if you're going out with a purpose, some things to throw in your bag better to have and not want than want and not have, right? What else? What else do you guys work with, use when you're doing this kind of work?
You got any tripods important, if you can use it?
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, you can't go chasing a bug around with a tripod.
Right. But you mentioned you can't tether, but you can tether because all these tools are available for phones and iPads and stuff like that. So if you had the time and you wanted to carry some more gear and some wires around, you really could tether while you're out in the wild and have that. Especially if you're just going to use a simple little camera. A lot of basic cameras like the little D5000, they doesn't even do bracketing. But if I tether it, I've got all those features and functionalities are coming from the tethered device. So now I have all that feature and functionality that wasn't included in the camera. I can take that with me on the road. So there's other reasons you might want to consider tethering out in the wild, because just put those tether tools on your phone and use it. That can be very helpful as well. Anything else? No? All right. Well, I thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Another fun workshop. Glad we finally got the demo to work out a little bit. And live demos are always tough. But I thank you all for coming. And I'm Jim Setzer for Images by Design. Take care.
Sorry.